show you the video, I have to explain how that happened and why that happened. So I made my little off-planet sojourn in October of 2008. And in December, so about 6-8 weeks later, I happened to be on a little island in the Caribbean called St. Bart's. And I bumped into my wife kind of a couple times in a row, just very briefly, kind of in passing. But then we happened to leave the island on the same plane. And so I'm thinking, if you guys have read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know how Zaphod Beeblebrox came down to Ford Prefect's girlfriend and said, "Hey baby, I'm from outer space, you should hang out with me," and she did. And so I'm thinking, I've got the best pickup lines of literally anybody on Earth, because I've literally just gotten back from space, and I have my laptop full of all this stuff from space. And so I'm sitting here in the airport trying to, impress this woman with my pictures from space. And what is actually going on through her head is, who is this blowhard who thinks I give a shit? And she literally just thought, this is some really egotistical jerk who I really, I have really no interest in this, until I showed this video. And if you ask her about this video, she'll say, it's a terrible movie, but it happens to include my mother in a key role. And she said when she saw my mother in it, it told her two things. It said, one, he's a nice guy because he put his mother in this pinnacle life experience. And two, he's probably not married, otherwise it would have been his wife. So this is literally what turned around my failing attempts to impress a girl, is the movie you're about to see now. It is a script written by Tracy Hickman. He was working on a game prototype a few years earlier called Party Flicks, a movie you could shoot at a party in order with one take, and that means you could do it really quickly, and that's why I contacted him to write me a script that I could shoot in space with my crewmates. It includes a little digital introduction, which is about a third of the length of the whole movie, so it's a very short movie, it's just a few minutes long, and much of it is the intro. But I'll have a few more kind of things about it and how my crew reacted to it. But this was shot in space, in order, so I could also premiere it in space, hopefully it's loud enough for you guys to hear. Let's find out.
If you have an analog jack.
I do, so hang on a second, I'm going to pause it here again. Hang on a second, just so we can get you guys some volume.
Use wires.
Pardon the delay. And while we're delayed, don't forget the whole reason to show the video first is so you can get a chance to buy more raffle tickets. And let's see here. See how that reaches. That reaches right there. Okay. Okay, now let's try this. If we were in front of that. Nope, you're not hearing. Yeah, we are. Is there any more volume? Maxed here. Maxed there. We're actually not, we're hearing through this projector, so hang on a second.
Know how to handle a laptop in space?
Yes, I'm trying to. Bear with, you're not missing much yet. There is, we're trying not, it's
Is there an output?
no, is there an output on it?
Oh. Is that where it's playing?
See it's coming from? Yeah, you want to see if you can plug it in there? I will pause it for a minute.
Alright, let's try it.
Still nothing. Is it in the output from the projector or the input from the
Projector, Dr. HD. Well, that's what you get. But it's important also to watch what's happening here because magic.
Hi, Richard. Hi. Hey, Mike left. We finally got rid of that guy. Man, I thought he'd never leave. And he was so annoying. All his tabula rasa this and computer games and man, and Ultima. Man, I got sick of Ultima. Hey guys, it's nice and good. Okay, we're ready for war. Okay. Hey. Still trying to juggle, Greg, I see. I wish Richard were still here. He really knew how to juggle in space. Hey, you know what? I wish he were here too, because he was really good at settling arguments. We're upside down. No, you're upside down. Obviously, you're upside down. You're the one who's upside down. No way. You're upside down. Turn over. You're upside down. Stop walking on the ceilings, man. It's freaking me out. Stop telling me I'm upside down. You're upside down. You're upside down. Hey guys, I should get oxygen. It's using more for brew. Okay. Let's just think about what might be the obvious reason. Maybe it's aliens, interstellar aliens trying to invade the space station as a prelude to invading Earth. Or maybe one of us is the alien. And the only way we can find out is if we're like using up, they're breathing too much oxygen. I know what. We can build some weapons out of a rudimentary lathe. I like that. Never give up. Never surrender. Hey guys, we have one visitors on board. Assist at station. Maybe it's an monster I saw. The id monster. Hey! It's Richard! Yeah! Didn't we see you leave?
Oh, well, yeah, guys, but I was having such a great time up here and I just didn't want to go, so I used an inflatable version of myself to hypnotize the crew so you couldn't tell the difference.
I'm not an alien. I'm Richard's mother. I came up on the supply ship with a message for you folks. You've been on this space station long enough. The garbage is piling up. The lawns need to be mowed. You all have to go home right now if you know what's good for you.
Darn it. I'm a doctor, not a... Oh, all right. But if we all leave, who's going to run the space station?
Hey, I did all my chores before I came out. Goodbye. Goodbye. Hey, don't worry, I'll take good care of her. Hey, Mom, when's dinner?
Please continue. Just
Thank you.
after that.
Yeah, oh yeah, no problem.
How is that
All right,
Russian
so-
guy not acted in anything
Sorry?
How is that Russian guy not acted in anything else?
The little story I was going to tell you about that is you probably didn't notice in the credits because we were still futzing with stuff, but you only saw 4 people in that movie. Well, my mom, 5. But there were two other people on orbit with us. There were two more Russian cosmonauts who were the people I came down to Earth with. And the original script that Tracy wrote included parts for them in this piece too. But when I got on orbit, and I showed them the script and said, hey, would you participate in this little movie I'm shooting? They actually said no. And the reason they said is kind of interesting. So the Russians are, no joke, extremely superstitious. And so, for example, you can't do things like shake hands through module doorways or on Earth through house doorways. I mean, if somebody comes to your house and knocks on the door and they reach out to shake your hand, you pull them into the house or you step out to shake hands. And there's this whole long list of things that they really truly, absolutely, really will or won't do, especially with space, based on superstition. And the two re-entries before my return from space with those two guys who aren't in the movie, they had some serious malfunctions during re-entry. And since the script includes me stowing away and not going to Earth with them, they thought that was really bad mojo. And they didn't want to do anything that might, increase the probability of us having a problem during re-entry. And so they wouldn't do it. And so I had to rewrite the script on orbit to, reassign other parts and cut a few things out in order to get it filmed with two fewer people. Odd, I thought. Okay, so just based on, chats that I had with some of the folks up in the meeting room upstairs, we thought it might be fun to skip out of games for a minute to talk about space. It's obviously something I enjoy a lot and talk about publicly a fair bit. And also just because I am a believer that, while it was, not very long ago, only members of government space programs go to space, one of the first private citizens to go, but the price is going to continue to come down and down, and the opportunities are going to become greater and greater. And I'm actually a believer that anybody, my age or younger generally, if they really want to, it's reasonable to start thinking about taking yourself to space. And so this is sort of my case for that. So I literally gave this is a PowerPoint presentation from a talk I gave last Saturday at the Explorers Club to make a case, talk both about my space trip and talk about how I think this is going to be available for so many more of us. And let's see if this thing will work here. It does. Okay. And so some of you may know also that in addition to my own flight, my father is an astronaut. I'm still the only second-generation American astronaut. I flew with the first second-generation Russian astronaut, one of the people who wouldn't be in the movie. And since then, there's a third person, also a Russian, so there's 3 generational astronauts now. But 50 years ago, my father was a professor at Stanford University studying upper ionospheric physics, in particular bouncing radio waves off the ionosphere to talk around the globe by bouncing radio signals. And so when Sputnik was launched, not only was that a big deal globally, but my dad had a place at Stanford where they could actually listen into Sputnik very well. And he could actually do scientific analysis on it because that was what his lab was basically set up to do. And so he was one of the few places on Earth that was just really well prepared to directly follow it. And so for him that was a big deal. That's actually really what both inspired him to choose to be an astronaut, and that skill was also what helped get him hired to be an astronaut. But of course, Sputnik also inspired, not just my dad, but a whole generation. And what's interesting about that is that, starting from 57-ish to 69, about 10 years, we went from putting the first object in space to landing on the moon. And in that 10 years, we made obviously an incredible amount of progress, and not just where we went as progress, but the invention of techniques and the invention of materials. Like, if you wanted to hold cryogenic, oxygen or hydrogen in a tank, you couldn't just use metal or steel or or aluminum or steel, any normal alloy that would frankly crack. Even to pump those cryogenic fuels around, those kind of things had to be invented, and so it was a very, very difficult but rapid progress journey that happened in that 10 years. And what's interesting about that is a lot of those technologies now are in like your air conditioner outside your house or in your car. And so these days you literally can buy a lot of those technologies off the shelf and they're in broad use. But a ton of stuff that was important to modern life was invented during this also say that the generation that was young at that time, which I would count myself in, that was also what inspired a lot of us to go into STEM activities. I would argue that the tech boom that we've had globally, but especially here in the United States, a large part of it goes back to these 10 years. Helped set that up. And but if you kind of also look at what we all believed what the future was going to be at that time, we all had this vision of Stanley Kubrick 2001 giant wagon wheels creating artificial gravity in space, which of course we're now 15 years past that, and we're nowhere near having that. In fact, I don't see it anywhere on the reasonably, next generation or two horizon to build something like that. And so, you kind of go like, hey, well, kind of what happened? Why we've now for the last 40 or 50 years, we've been kind of stuck in low Earth orbit. And so, what do we do about that? And a big part of it is, in my mind, this pretty simple calculus, which is traveling to space up until now has been incredibly expensive. It's also been pretty darn dangerous. And if things are both incredibly expensive and pretty dangerous, it should not be too surprising that it's fairly uncommon. And for the last 30 years, which is about how long we've had the space station around, if you're trying to think of something useful to do in space, like to earn a living with it or do some commercial development or even scientific research that is worth the investment, if it costs you 50 to 100, well, in fact, the space station cost us about $100 billion to assemble it. It costs us $2 billion a year as taxpayers just to keep it from dumping into the ocean. And it costs us, on the shuttle era, about $100 million per astronaut to put someone there. And so if you're trying to do anything with that as the basis of expense, again, it is really hard to justify. And so when people are skeptical about the money we put into space at the space station, frankly, I kind of agree with it. I actually go, that's just really a tough nut to crack. But that's also what is now changing so rapidly, we'll come back to in just a minute. But coming back into my journey, you obviously know my father was an astronaut, as I've mentioned. He flew twice, once on Skylab in '73, 10 years later in '83 on the 9th launch of the space shuttle. My mother, who you just saw, she's a professional artist. She helped me make the little silver snake thing that I've always worn that's permanently attached to my neck. And kind of got me into not only all different kinds of art, but also giant projects. With the money my parents made out of investing in Origin, she took the money that she got back and created this Leonardo's Discovery Warehouse, an art and science museum in her hometown of Enid, Oklahoma, that is, it is not only extremely high quality, it is monumental in scale. And while, for the haunted houses and things we've done down through the years, or the games we produce, we get hundreds, and sometimes many hundreds of people involved on projects, and our projects might last a couple years, a few years these days. But my mom brings together much larger projects. And so, for example, she had, in a city that has a population of 400,000 people, she got 40,000 people to come out here and help her build this. And so where I got my big projecting skills plus art comes from my mother. Got the technology side from my dad, and that of course leads over into high-tech, I think the quintessential high-tech art, which is video games. And so I at least believe I can draw my desire to be in this business really to the combination of both my parents. And you guys know Origin, Destination Games, and Port Larry. But I've also, at the same time, I've been a big believer in, or I've been very passionate about exploration. This all predates games too. I've loved to go travel. But I have an attitude towards travel. In the book that is coming out January 10th called Explore and Create, I talk about why I think these two things are really deeply related, and even from how to do games well. I'll, to come back to that in a second, as my passion for exploration has increased, I've helped build companies to explore farther and farther. And so I've been down to places like the Titanic and the South Pole, and I did all that by co-founding the companies to take you there. Because, in the middle of Antarctica, there were governments that went there, but there were no private industry that went there until a group of people gets together and say, let's go do it. And so we did. And, so to go film the movie Titanic, it was done with Deep Ocean Expeditions, a company I'm part of, that chartered those subs to James Cameron. The people who go down to Antarctica, most of them are mountain climbers who want to climb the highest peak on all 7 continents. So that keeps that's really what started the company. But if we want to do the things we went down and do is like meteorite hunting and stuff like that. But lest you think that these are unrelated, and what you'll see if you get my book that comes out in January, I actually believe that if you're creating a virtual reality, which is what we were all sharing with the games we play together, I think being a keen observer and having a passionate interest in the details of the reality in which we live is really important. And to me, it manifests in the oddest ways. I mean, as you know, we have a really talented group of folks back in Austin. But whenever we bring in new, I'll use the example of world builders, new designers, they may or may not have a background in things like urban planning and architecture, which technically I don't either. But I do, because again, this exploration bent, I do pay really close attention. I'm really inspired to pay attention to all the infrastructure that I see around me in a city, for example. And when we bring in new designers, it's often, you'll see them do things like, when you think of a neighborhood in the real world, houses are always back to back in kind of rows, 2 by 2, for 6 or 8 houses long, and then you build another block, a city block. And that's so that everybody has frontage on a road, but otherwise their back fences can be against each other. And that minimizes the cost of roads. But when you bring in a new designer, they may or may not have ever thought of that. And so one of the things I always see when we bring in new people is to see when they make some of these simple mistakes of reality crafting that to me are just because they're not quite as passionate about paying attention to those silly details as either I am or I think they should be for the kind of task they're taking on. And so the point is, I think these are related. That's just an example of how I think exploration and that sort of thing is closely tied together. But what I also find interesting is, for people like myself who are inspired to get into high-tech businesses because of Apollo, and also simultaneously sad that 2001 never happened, it's interesting to see how many people really haven't given up on that, have circled back and said, we're going to help change. We're going to, since NASA and the government didn't make that be the future, let's just go make it happen ourselves. And so not only did I help start things like the X Prize and some of these other things that help bring that into being, but same thing is true of Elon Musk, who by the way is an Ultima player also. Jeff Bezos, same sort of background. You can go through a long list. Paul Allen, one of the co-founders of Microsoft, same thing. The number of people who went and made high-tech businesses that then go and turn a lot of that money back over into opening up commercial spaceflight is a notable list. At least for me, I also had the circumstance that since my father was an astronaut, my neighbors were astronauts as well, since I lived just a couple blocks outside the markets of NASA. I sort of grew up believing everybody went to space. Up until I had a doctor at NASA tell me that because I needed glasses, I was no longer eligible to go to space. And that kind of frankly pissed me off. And before that, I would never have said when I grew up I'm going to go to space. I just assumed it would happen. And suddenly I was kicked out of the club. And after going through the 7 stages of grief, I finally said, well, my solution is I'm going to go build a civilian space agency. But of course, at the age of 13, you don't really do much about that. But I started to make games at the age of 15, 16, 17. And so as soon as I had money coming in from games, literally all the personal investing I've done since then, if not in my own game companies, and have had some money managed by financial planners that rarely did anything useful with it, all the money that I invested myself was always in opening up space and or really exotic travel kind of related to the steps of getting to space. And so the ones that I invested in a bunch that failed. The getting yourself into space is not trivial, as you would imagine. And I invested in and backed a bunch of companies, often started by astronauts that I grew up with, who I admired as a kid growing up. These were my parental figures. Most of those did not work. And it wasn't until I kind of found this like-minded group of entrepreneurs that we managed to crack it open with things like the X Prize, Zero G Corporate Space Adventures. And so Finally, in 2007 is when I committed to my own spaceflight. There was an opening that was available. We thought it was comfortably after Tabula Rasa would be launching, and of course, games always take much longer than you hope. And so, in fact, it ended up squeezing the back end of Tabula Rasa a bit. But even though you know have the money and you've paid the money to Russia and you're signed up to go, doesn't mean they will let you go. There's still one more hurdle, which is you have to pass medical pre-qualification. And when I went and had my medical scans done, they actually found that I had a malformation of my liver. I was missing one vein on my liver, and that made a dead-end lobe of liver that on Earth is irrelevant, but in space, if there was a depressurization event, would mean that it could create internal bleeding, which you could neither detect or fix, so it would be fatal. And so first I got a phone call saying, you're kicked off the flight, you're forever, you're disqualified from flight, and by the way, you don't get your money back. And so that was, after this 30 years of trying to make this happen, that was obviously a pretty bad day. But later the same afternoon, I got a call back and said, we've got a solution, which is you have to go have that lobe of your liver removed, like tomorrow. And so that's what I did. And then after that, I had to go prove that these wounds would not be a problem for me to go through high G reentry maneuvers. I had to go do a bunch of centrifuge work, etc. But then, we were talking earlier about training. One of us was talking about training and passenger versus astronaut. Right. And there are some people who went via the way I did, like Charles Simonyi, one of the co-founders of Microsoft. He's flown twice, once literally just before me and literally just after me. And he described himself as a space tourist, and he's very happy to have that word, and that's what he thinks he did. He said, look, I paid my money, I went on this joyride, I had a good time, that's all there was to it. I actually don't like that term applied to myself. And the reason is that, one, I built the frickin' company. Two, not only did all of us train to the exact same specifications as every other astronaut and cosmonaut, we had to pass the exact same tests, first individually and then as a crew. And to operate the vehicle, you have a job to do that if you don't do, everybody dies. So, you're not a passenger. But also, unlike Charles Simonyi, I took on a very heavy workload. I did which I'll get into in a minute, I did a large number of both commercial and scientific work to try to not only offset the amazing price I paid to be there, but also to try to find businesses that we could all get involved in that would pay, hopefully pay more than the cost of going to space, which I think is happening, which I'll get back to. But I had to learn how to operate the Soyuz, I learned how to operate the ISS, had to go through a variety of aspects of survival training, had to take all the exact same exams, as I mentioned, as every other crewmate. And then finally, in October, 8 years ago, I became the 483rd person to leave the Earth. We're now at about 520 people, I think, since then, that have left the Earth. One of the things about getting to space is how short it is. From the moment the engines light, it is only 510 seconds, about 8.5 minutes, before you've burned about 95% of the mass of the vehicle, dropped off a couple of stages, everything shuts down, and you're in orbit. And so it's a very, very quick journey. It's less time than it takes you to get to altitude on an airplane and have a seatbelt light turned off. I spent 2 days living aboard the Soyuz, the vehicle I went up on. 2 nights later, we docked with the International Space Station, and then this became sort of my work area. You see this little green zone right there? That's actually my workspace. But you'll also notice there's stuff just crammed on the floor, and all the walls and the ceiling, and so there's really no empty space. It's basically a big tangle of wires and junk. And when you fly through the space station, if you accidentally bump a wall, you tend to bump stuff off that then follows you down the hallway. It's quite a bit of a mess. The original space station was also built only to handle 3 people. There's only one. The galley has one table with kind of 3 places to sit around it. So you end up half the people sitting on the ceiling, half the people sitting on the floor, in order to cram around this tiny little table in order to share your meals. There are only 2 little hutches, little phone booth size sleeping quarters for 6 people. And so the other 4 people basically camp out in the hallway. And the space station has, more than a dozen modules, maybe 15 modules. And so you can actually have a whole module to yourself. And so this was my camp out location was in the ESA Columbus module. And while a lot of people go to sleep very easily by just sort of relaxing and you kind of take a fetal position and you hang there and find that very easy to go to sleep. And the one thing you must do is tie a shoestring to the wall somewhere or you will float through the space station and wake up on the air conditioning intake vents. So you at least need to tie yourself down. I'm a tucked in, face down sleeper, and so I actually found it kind of hard to go to sleep. And so I use bungee cords to try to simulate gravity to attach myself to the floor or the wall or something, but it never really worked that well. And if anybody wants, I'm happy to tell the story of the space toilet. There's lots of great reasons to be in space, but food and personal hygiene are not 2 of them. But also to talk a little bit about this is the activities, the main list of activities I was doing in space, and I'll talk a little bit about protein crystal growth. I also helped develop a piece of software called Windows on Earth, which was to help me take Earth observation photography. That now has become the standard tool that all astronauts and cosmonauts use. They actually acquired the software and use it on board the space station now permanently. My vision, which is what kept me out of space originally, I've had laser corrective eye surgery since, and once NASA found out that I was flying, they've never had somebody go to space who's had that corrective surgery because they've banned it. But since they couldn't stop me, and they really actually wanted to approve it, but they wanted a test case before they approved it, I became the test case. So, and after I gave them participate in this experiment is now approved. So the astronaut candidates can now have had corrective eye surgery before applying. This is this thing called protein crystal growth. It's something I go into in some detail, but suffice to say, if you were trying to make a drug to combat, say, AIDS, there's every disease function has a protein involved in that disease function. One common method of combating that disease is to create a molecule that you can swallow that would go into your bloodstream. It would bond very strongly with the protein that would otherwise manifest the disease. But if you're going to design a molecule to bond with a protein, it's nice to have an exact picture of what the protein looks like, so you can design a molecule that will mate with it well. And the way to do that is often by growing a crystal of the protein. But to crystallize, if you're crystallizing water, which is obviously a little V-shaped molecule, that crystallizes pretty easy. But if you're trying to crystallize one of these things, they grow very slowly, they're very complicated, they require very particular conditions, and on Earth, when you change phases from liquid to solid, it gives off a little bit of heat, which creates a little bit of turbulence, like in a pot of boiling water, and it disturbs the growth of crystals. But if you grow them in space, they grow more purely, and they grow larger because there's no convection currents. And so it turns out this is something that I believe will save years and many millions of dollars in drug development. I flew it, and then I flew the same experiment with Guy Laliberté, the founder of Cirque du Soleil, took it up, and it's flown twice since. And we're taking on harder and harder proteins with this process since. On the Earth observations photography, my dad on Skylab took some of the first pictures of the Earth from space as seen by astronauts, because the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo folks were really thinking about the moon, not Earth. And so I wanted to reshoot a lot of those spots to show how the Earth had changed in 35 years. And I worked with groups like the Nature Conservancy to find targets to pick out and took these. But the reason why I developed this piece of software was normally, if an astronaut's going to take a picture out the window, if you look through that little porthole there, and you can see some clouds and a little bit of ground, but good luck knowing what's under the clouds. And what they were often given is a printout. They would literally get a printout and say, hey, why don't you take a picture of Perth, Australia, at 6:20 and 54 seconds. And so it didn't say in the morning or evening in this case. But you can kind of tell the track of the space station will be kind of down and to the side, and that Perth probably is out the left side window. And since it's right on the coastline, you might be able to tell that's coming up, right? You have some odds of looking out the window and finding